They thought they had won. In their mind, the story was already finished. You were outmaneuvered, outplayed, out of the picture. And for a moment, it may have even looked that way from the outside. They controlled the narrative, shaped perceptions, and walked away with a sense of superiority. But what they called victory was not grounded in reality. It was built on distortion. You see, a false victory always depends on maintaining an illusion. It requires constant reinforcement, constant validation, and often the silent cooperation of others who either don't see the truth or are too afraid to confront it. This is not power. This is dependency disguised as dominance. From a psychological perspective, what they experienced was not triumph, but ego inflation. The ego, when threatened, does not seek truth. It seeks preservation. So it constructs a version of events where it remains untouched, unchallenged, and ultimately right. But the problem with this defense is that reality does not negotiate with illusion. It waits, and time has a way of exposing what performance tries to hide. Because when the noise fades, when there is no one left to impress, no one left to manipulate, the individual is left alone with themselves. And that is where the illusion begins to crack. Not publicly, not dramatically, but internally, quietly, persistently. Meanwhile, what they dismissed as weakness, your silence, your withdrawal, your refusal to engage, was actually the beginning of something far more real. You stepped out of the illusion, and once you do that, you are no longer playing the same game. This is the part they never anticipated, because they believed the outcome was determined by control. But in truth, the outcome is always determined by alignment with reality. And reality does not reward illusion, it dismantles it. So what they thought was the end was only the beginning of their awakening. What followed was something they could neither predict nor understand: your silence. Not the kind of silence that comes from defeat, but the kind that emerges from awareness. This is where the real shift begins, though. To the outside observer, it appears as nothing at all. Most people assume power is expressed through reaction, through defending oneself, proving a point, or reclaiming a narrative. But as Carl Jung often suggested in his exploration of the psyche, true transformation happens inwardly, not performatively. When you chose not to argue, not to chase, not to explain, you stepped out of the psychological framework they were relying on, because their sense of control depended on your participation. Every reaction you gave them reaffirmed their influence. Every attempt to be understood kept you entangled in their version of reality. But when you withdrew, calmly, deliberately, you removed the very foundation of their perceived power. And this is where it becomes uncomfortable for them. Silence creates a void, and the human mind is not designed to tolerate unresolved spaces. In that void, questions begin to form, doubts begin to surface. They start replaying moments, analyzing your absence, trying to make sense of something they can no longer control. Meanwhile, your silence is not passive. It is active, disciplined, and deeply intentional. You are no longer investing energy in being seen correctly by them. Instead, you are redirecting that energy toward understanding yourself more clearly. This is not retreat. This is recalibration. And in that process, something subtle but profound occurs. You detach not just from them, but from the need for their validation altogether. That is the moment the power dynamic truly shifts, not when they notice your absence, but when you no longer need to be noticed. Because real power is not loud, reactive, or desperate to be acknowledged. It is quiet, grounded, and entirely self-sufficient. And the moment you stop explaining yourself is the moment you stop being controlled. And then, inevitably, reality begins to assert itself. Not all at once, not in some dramatic collapse, but in subtle, undeniable ways. The absence they once dismissed now becomes something they cannot ignore. The space you left behind does not remain empty, it becomes a mirror. At first, they attempt to fill it. Distractions, new connections, surface level validation. But these are temporary measures, psychological substitutes that lack depth. Because what they truly lost was not just a person, but a dynamic, a source of attention, of control, of emotional reinforcement. And without that, something feels off, though they may not immediately admit it. This is where reality begins its quiet work. Without your presence to project onto, they are left with themselves. And as Carl Jung emphasized, the individual who avoids self-confrontation will inevitably be confronted by it. The parts of themselves they once externalized, blame, insecurity, dissatisfaction, no longer have a convenient target. So the mind begins to turn inward, often reluctantly. Questions arise. Why doesn't it feel the same? Why didn't they react? Why is their absence more unsettling than their presence ever was? These are not comfortable questions because they challenge the narrative the ego worked so hard to construct. And this is the moment where the illusion starts to fracture. Not because you said anything, not because you fought back, but because reality is no longer being filtered through distortion. It is experienced directly. Meanwhile, your life continues, quietly, steadily, without the need to prove anything. And that contrast between your grounded progression and their internal unrest becomes impossible to ignore. Because what they are experiencing is not loss in the conventional sense. It is the loss of control, the loss of certainty, the loss of a version of reality that no longer holds. And reality, once it begins to surface, does not retreat. It reveals, it confronts, and ultimately it demands truth. And the truth they avoided becomes the very thing they can no longer escape. And this is where the real tension begins to surface, not in their external world, but within their own psyche. Because now they are caught between two opposing forces. The ego, which insists they were right, and reality, which quietly but persistently contradicts that belief. The ego is not designed to surrender easily. It protects identity, often at the cost of truth. It tells them they made the right choice, that they were justified, that nothing of value was lost. But reality does not argue, it demonstrates. And over time, the gap between what they tell themselves and what they actually experience becomes impossible to ignore. This creates a kind of internal fracture. On one side, there is the version of themselves they want to believe in, composed, victorious, unaffected. On the other, there is the growing awareness that something is unresolved, something miscalculated, and the mind struggles to reconcile these two realities. As Carl Jung observed, the greatest conflicts are not between people, but within the individual. When a person avoids confronting their own contradictions, those contradictions do not disappear. They intensify. They manifest as restlessness, irritation, even quiet regret that cannot be easily explained. And so they begin to feel it in subtle ways, a thought they can't quite silence, a comparison they didn't expect to make, a memory that returns, not with clarity, but with discomfort. These are not random occurrences. They are signals, indicators that the narrative is breaking down, because the ego thrives on certainty, but reality introduces doubt. And doubt, when left unresolved, begins to erode even the strongest illusions. What once felt like confidence starts to feel like defensiveness. What once felt like control begins to feel like instability. Meanwhile, you are no longer part of that internal conflict. You have stepped outside of it, And that is what makes this shift so profound. Not that they are struggling, but that their struggle no longer involves you. Because in the end, the ego can resist many things, but it cannot withstand truth forever. And when truth finally breaks through, it doesn't just challenge the illusion, it dismantles it completely. And while this internal conflict unfolds within them, something equally significant is happening on your side, though it is far less visible, far less performative. You begin to change, not in a way that seeks attention, but in a way that reflects alignment. Your energy is no longer scattered, trying to fix, explain, or prove. It becomes focused, deliberate, and grounded. This is what people often misunderstand about growth. They expect it to be loud, to be announced, to be validated by others. But real transformation is quiet. It happens in your habits, your standards, your willingness to let go of what once defined you. And over time, this quiet evolution becomes undeniable. From a psychological standpoint, this is the integration of the self, a process Carl Jung described as individuation. You are no longer reacting from wounded patterns or external expectations. You are acting from awareness, and that shift changes everything. Now, when they look at you, whether directly or from a distance, they are not just seeing a person way or moved on. They are witnessing a version of you that no longer fits into the role they assigned. And that is deeply unsettling because it removes their ability to interpret you through the lens of the past. Your peace becomes confusing to them. Your silence, once dismissed, now carries weight. Your progress, once irrelevant, now becomes a point of comparison. And without intending to, you become a mirror, not reflecting who they were, but who they failed to understand. This is where the discomfort intensifies, because your growth highlights their stagnation. Your clarity exposes their confusion, and your detachment reveals the depth of their dependence. But what makes this truly powerful is that you are not doing it for them. You are not evolving to prove a point or to create a reaction. You are simply becoming more aligned with yourself, and that authenticity cannot be imitated or manipulated, because in the end, the most powerful response is not revenge, not explanation, not even closure. It is transformation, and nothing unsettles illusion more than someone who has outgrown it. And finally, the culmination of everything they failed to anticipate becomes unmistakable, the ultimate power flip. They believed that influence, control, or presence defined power. They measured it by reactions, by attention, by their ability to provoke. But true power is never transactional. True power is the alignment of action with reality and the integrity of self that cannot be manipulated from the outside. In psychology, this is the space where ego meets the higher self. Carl Jung often spoke about the necessity of confronting illusions in order to reach individuation. You have done that. By stepping away from the need for validation, by refusing to play their game, by cultivating your own growth and understanding, you have shifted the axis of influence. And this shift is not subtle, it is seismic. They begin to sense it, even if they cannot name it. Their strategies, their manipulations, their attempts to reassert control all begin to feel futile. The ground they thought was solid beneath their feet is now unstable. And as they scramble to regain what they cannot, the narrative, the influence, the reaction, they realize that the game has already changed. You are no longer a player in their story. You are an entirely separate force. This is where reality deals its final blow to the ego. They are confronted not with humiliation or punishment, but with something far more powerful: irrelevance. Their actions, once impactful, now pass like whispers against a wall. Their control, once assumed, now reveals its emptiness. And the one thing they cannot recover, the true measure of their lost power, is the autonomy and inner sovereignty you have claimed. Because real power is not taken, it is realized. It is earned internally. And when you live aligned with truth, grounded in self awareness, and detached from their illusions, nothing can shake you, nothing can sway you. And so, the victory they believed they had was never theirs to begin with. The true winner has always been the one who refuses to surrender to illusion, who grows quietly, and who moves through life, guided not by others' expectations, but by the unshakable reality of their own becoming.